something, but thanks for putting that together. It was a good week, it certainly was. This didn't get in the bulletin, but there's posters in the back if you're interested in handing them out for next Sunday's program. When the Gospel Echoes are here, help yourself to that and get them posted around our community. All right, I've titled the message this morning in our series on surviving the swamp. I've entitled it, "This Swamp is Not My Home." Taken from a song that we normally sing, but that's really what it means. We're living in this swamp, so we're really not a part of it, but we're trying to survive it. I appreciate very much the several responses I've received from you as far as comments and thoughts and sharing with me what you are learning and what you've learned, what you've taken away from this book. That helps me realize that at least a couple of you are thinking through how this is affecting our life and our living today. I hope that we're not so comfortable being swamp dwellers that it has become the norm for our lives, because that's pretty dangerous. The aim of Daniel is to get us to a place in our focus well beyond Babylon, to our future hope, and to live lives accordingly. It's so easy to get focused on today and tomorrow and just what's in front of us. But Daniel, I think, really gives us a message. Look out there. That's what we're living for. We're living for the future. And he's talking about the present, but then he ends up with this great prophecies that we're going to be looking at later on. I'm wondering this morning if I would ask each of you individually if there was one thing in your life for which you would never compromise, just what your answer would be. And I thought about spending some time and just listening, because these guys had to put it right out there in front of hundreds of people of what their thing in life was that they wouldn't compromise. What is that in your life? Is there anything for which you would die for, or at least that you would make a stand for that would set you apart from everyone else? I'd have to question myself with the same thing. Whether it be a standard which I have cemented in my life, which I would choose to end a relationship with somebody because it compromises that standard, or would I reject a job offered to me if it required me to compromise my convictions? You know, I'm glad, as I look back on my history, that I've been fortunate in always having had a job opportunity before me which did not require me to work on Sunday. Which in my mind is a very sacred day, in which I have set it aside for respite and renewal and refreshment, which is really for my benefit, but also it changes and draws me closer to my Savior when I have that one day that I can completely focus on that relationship. I've never had to make the choice of refusing employment because my conscience was challenged. Some of you no doubt have faced that. I know we've excused jobs that have to be taken care of, like nursing and taking care of even the animals. You know, I used to work on a farm as I was growing up. We every day would milk those cows, whether it was Sunday or not. So that all had to be done. But I'm referring more to things where it doesn't have to be done, but that we've kind of just went into that. In fact, when I was a kid growing up, Sunday was a special day. There was almost nothing open except maybe the bars or restaurants in town. But today, there's almost nothing closed. What's changed? Has God changed His way of looking at things, or has the swamp got us to change and move its direction, which is frightening to me that can happen to us. I know the Joneses are dealing with this very thing right now, as their daughter is wanting to take driver's training, and for some reason they have scheduled the meetings on Sunday morning right during worship time. I mean, that never used to be heard of. Today it's kind of the norm that Sunday's just a day like any other day. So maybe you think I'm too legalistic, making Sunday that special, that high and holy day. But I guess it's a little like what we saw in chapter 1 of this book, where Daniel and his three friends were being compromised in so many things in their life, in their masculinity, in their language, in their social setting, and then they wanted to compromise their diet, their kosher diet, which they felt very strongly about. And Daniel said, no, wait a minute. You're not going to take that. I'm going to stand for what is important to me. God told us this was his way, and this is the way we want to do it. Maybe the Sunday thing isn't a big deal to you, but my question is, what is? What is there in your life that you would make a stand for, then you would never give it up? If we're not satisfied to be swamp dwellers, then there should surely be something that makes it obvious that we do not belong there. It was testing time for these three Hebrew boys, and it was multiple choice. I always liked those kind, because then I didn't have to think too hard for the answer. I don't think these guys had to think for the answer either. They had it in their mind before they went into this, what their answer would be. But the choice was, you either bow or will you choose to burn? Those were the answers on the quiz. How were they going to answer? Pretty simple. Let's read. Take your Bible, chapter 3. I wish I could read the whole thing. These stories are so long, but we're going to be running out of time. So I'll just read the first 18 verses of chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, the psaltery, and in symphony of all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." There are certain Jews, isn't it interesting? They pointed out the Jews, certain Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I've set up? Now, if you are ready at the time you hear the sound," he didn't give them a chance to answer. If you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, psaltery, and in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Picked up somewhere that there was something like 20 years had passed between last Sunday's message about the the statue in his dream and this chapter. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but if it is true, Nebuchadnezzar had spent all that time continuing to conquer and to grow his kingdom. He was the it stuff, and as he did that, he probably never shook that dream which had put his kingdom at the top as the head, but he also must have caused him a lot of trepidation to think of all those other nations below him that in the interpretation said that they were going to take over after him, which had to cause him a lot of concern, meaning that he was not going to be always at the top. And that, in his mind, that was not true. It all meant that his demise was somewhere down the road, and that was not something that he wanted to contemplate. And this must have continued to grow in his thinking until he came up with this plot to seal it, at least in his leaders' minds, that he was the one and only ruler and that Babylon was here to stay. And it seems as the gem that was going to assure that was this idolatrous figure which he concocted to resemble the supernatural message which he had heard, but changed to make the whole thing the head, the whole thing gold instead of just the head. He heard what Daniel had said, but in his mind, this is what he wanted it to be. He, being Nebuchadnezzar, was not going to settle for just being the head of this image. He was going to be the whole thing. His kingdom, if he had anything to do about it, was going to be forever. And if he could have just at least convince his rulers, those under him, that that was true, then there would never be any opposition. So he had a good plan to make that happen. So he brought them all together for that purpose. Now, this thing is quite interesting, this image, in the way that it looks, the way it was built, because it's way out of proportion to what a structure usually is. It says it was 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide at its base. How many know how high that was? We don't measure by cubits, so that's probably doesn't tell us a whole lot. But that's a 10-to-1 ratio. Most humans, when they're standing, would be like a 4-to-1 ratio if you would compare that, or maybe 5-to-1. There might be a few that are 2-to-1. That's not good. But this tall, skinny thing is way out of proportion to what is normal. In our measurements, it was like 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide at the base. I don't know how you'd ever keep that thing upright. The little skinny bottom, and it goes way up in the air. When I was a kid on the farm, we put up a 60-foot silo, which I thought was way up to the sky, and it was 20 feet wide. So that, was a lot better ratio, 3-to-1. But just imagine another 30 feet on top of that and only 9 feet, and I can't imagine a structure like that standing. But it certainly was an attention getter out there in the middle of the plain with the sun shining and reflecting off that bright gold. But there's something else which is quite interesting about this, and that's the number 6. 6, which was the number of man, and it was mentioned both in its height and in its width. Who else in the Bible wanting to make himself ruler of the whole earth is numbered with 6? You think of anybody? The Antichrist, the last ruler of the time of the Gentiles, is also big on 6. 666, so that's the number of man. It's almost like both of these guys are trying to get to perfection, trying to get to godliness, which number 7 is God's number, so they're almost there, but can't quite make it. And so 6, the number of man is big with both these guys. That just kind of stuck out to me as something interesting. So anyway, here's this huge statue which probably resembled Nebuchadnezzar. I wouldn't imagine he would make it look like anybody else. And he sent out the mandatory invitation for all his underling officials to come. Verse 3, sure enough, we see they all came. Now, when I first read these 2 verses, which are almost verbatim, I wondered, why wasn't that shortened? Why didn't they just say they all came? Instead of saying the governors, all of them again. and I don't know if it's meant to be this or not, but got me to thinking that it really is a kind of a subtle, almost humorous insight into the lack of personal integrity of all these leaders. It reiterates that they're all big shots, but none of them had the courage to say no. They all came. They all walked in there spinelessly following the lead of Nebuchadnezzar. It's almost tongue-in-cheek. They all chose to be humiliated by someone who had authority over them, because you think about that. He's demanding something of them, of which they probably didn't want to do, and yet they are willingly following the herd to do it. Like a bunch of rubber ducks already to quack the same way. Just no integrity, no character, no nothing. If Nebuchadnezzar says all worship the idol, we'll all worship the idol. We got jobs to keep. That's the way of the swamp. When it says do something, we just mindlessly follow with that rather than standing by our principles. If it tells you something is right for you to do, you do it. If it says it's all right for you to go shack up with your girlfriend without the certificate of marriage, you can do it. After all, you don't need a piece of paper to tell you that you love each other, do you? And if it says that something is fun, you have to try it out. That's why the political world right now is in such a turmoil, because someone would dare to do things differently than what the swamp declares and proclaims that they should be done. And the swamp doesn't know how to deal with that. What is normal is what they know and how they've always done it, and so you throw a wrench in that and they come unglued. But verse 5 says, he assembled a huge orchestra and ordered that whenever it played, everyone was to stop what they were doing, get off their iPhones, and bow down and worship the statue. Now, Daniel is strangely missing. I don't know why. I don't have any explanation for that, but he's not there, which in itself is interesting. But it's important to note that with him missing, our three Hebrew boys had to weather this storm without his wise leadership over their group. In other words, this was a test of their ability to stand alone. Many of us would never compromise our convictions if someone else from the church were with us in a questionable situation. But it might be a different story if no one knew us and saw us compromise. If they would have made a pact not to tell each other, well, it wouldn't have been a big deal to bow down, would it? And then there's always the whisper of the enemy trying to convince us that to bend is really not that big a deal. You know, you really wouldn't be worshiping, but just complying with what's expected of an official, and you could do it real quick and then get out of here and no one be the wiser. Have you ever heard that recording? I've heard it a time or two in my life. I'm sure these guys heard it as well, but you know what? They didn't listen, and neither should we. You know why they didn't listen? I see three reasons for that. The first is that they were first and foremost men of deep conviction, which really surprises me, coming from a backslidden history that they had with Israel, because Israel was completely away from God at the time of the capture. And yet these guys somehow got it, so much so that they were willing to stand up and die for what they believed was right. They had deeply held beliefs when it came to idol worship. They, of course, didn't bow. Nebuchadnezzar went through the instructions all again, explaining to them. He must have thought, man, if you guys are wise men, it sure takes you a long time to catch on. But then he said that he'd give them another chance. But what was their response? Verses 16 to 18, no, we don't need another chance. Our mind is made up. We know what we believe, and so don't spend your time wasting that on another chance. Again, I'm impressed, like I say, with their commitment. They knew what they believed. More importantly, they believed what they knew so deeply that they were willing to lay down their lives for the truth. Their convictions ran so deep that they'd rather burn than bow. You know, that element seems to be sorely missing in today's church. We're so easily swayed by any wind of doctrine which comes along. It's almost like we're grasping at things to make church more relevant to the people around us rather than making sure it's solidly based on what is our firm foundation. It doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt to change the way we do things to minister to changing society, but don't compromise truth in making that happen. And I'm seeing truth being set on a shelf and new things brought in that are really out there and don't need to be done in this context. They can be somewhere else. But these guys, they weren't about to compromise. They'd been there and done that. But now they're totally convinced that God is who he said he was and needs to be worshiped as God alone. Now, most of us will not be faced with the choice between compromise and execution. We might. A lot of our brothers and sisters are facing that right today as we speak. Well, we might not have to do that. But the issue is the same regardless of the penalty. So again, I ask, what is there in your life which is important enough that you would never compromise? I want you to think about that as we leave this morning, as we walk through this week. I guess another way of asking the same question is, what price can we be bought for? You see, many of us fail in the Christian life because we're not willing to pay even the price of the loss of popularity or loneliness or ridicule or economic hardship. Man, those things are tough. We don't want to go it alone. And only those who have enough conviction to be willing to pay the price, even if it is the price of death itself, only these people make a real difference in this world. So first of all, they were men of deep conviction. The second thing I see that stands out is that they were men with complete confidence in God. You see what they said? Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, but if not, let it be known to you that we're satisfied with what he does. Complete confidence in God. Nebuchadnezzar, you want to know what God can save us? Ours is able to. They were completely convinced of that fact. But how did they know? They'd never seen him do that before. Wouldn't it be easier to have that kind of faith if we've seen him bring somebody out or through the fiery furnace? But they'd never experienced that. Somehow their faith was so strong, they believed even without having experienced before. If we truly believe that our God is all-powerful, we cannot doubt that he can do anything he chooses. And I have to say, sometimes he chooses to let us burn. I don't like it. I hate that sometimes we have to suffer like that, but sometimes that's his choice. Does that make him any less God? When he allows Christians to be beheaded or crucified by ISIS, is he abandoning his children? No. He could choose to have that knife somehow malfunction and come back and slay the enemy if he wanted. But for some reason, which and maybe we can't understand now, he allows it to happen. I don't know why. He doesn't always choose to heal Christians. But we seem to want to hold that over his head. And come on, God, if you really loved me, you would heal me. No, our way of looking at a situation is not always the way God looks at it. And he has a plan that's being worked out that we need to just submit to and say, you're God, I submit to that. Again, we don't always understand, but we got to believe that it's God's will or he's not our God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had complete trust in God, confidence in his power, and allowed them to say what they said. But there's still one more thing that stands out as being unique, and that's that they were men with a firm commitment to God. They couldn't care if this was the president of Babylon or the president of the United States. It wouldn't matter to them. God was the one who mattered. True faith, mature faith, is seen in a commitment to do God's will no matter what God does. Even if he doesn't save us from harm, even if he allows us to burn in the fire, even if he doesn't cure us from cancer. He's God. You see, as mature believers know, we have a God who can save, but one who in his sovereign wisdom may know it's better not to save. So real faith is seen in a commitment to God no matter what happens, because as people like these three men, we can trust God's wisdom and sovereignty because we're convinced that inevitably it is going to come out as the winner. He'll work in all things for our good. You see, confident faith cannot always be proved by cause and effect on this side of eternity. There are times when we must place our emphasis on he's able or he will, but in this age of feel-good religion, there's also the need to stress, but if not. It can be that way, and it often is. We can't demand from God that he do it our way. There are literally millions of Christians who have done just that. Read this week, in the last 2,000 years, 70 million Christians have died because of their faith, and over half of them have done so in the last 100 years. 35,000 people dying in 100 years. That's a lot of Christians who have given their life, but have stood as these three guys did, that God was God. These young men's conviction led them to the mouth of the furnace. Now this must have been some kind of a mound of earth that was built up with the furnace inside of that, because it says they marched them up and then dropped them in. So there they go marching up. You know, it's more exciting to watch a convicted criminal march to his death than just to have him do it in secret. So that's always a big thing the night of the execution, that he's marching in here, he's got his last meal, you know, you're making a do of that. That's what they did with these guys. They could, all the people could see them march up. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar was so mad when they chose to go against what he commanded, that he commanded the fire to be made 7 times hotter. And in my inquisitive mind, I wants to know, how would you measure that? How do you measure if it's 7 times hotter? Does it just mean that they put in 7 times more wood? Furthermore, if you wanted to make them suffer more, you'd make the fire less hot, not more hot, because then it would take longer for them to... Anyway, that was my mind. It would have done the same job with lesser fire rather than more, but hey, if you want to prove even more the power of God, go for it. But it was so hot that it killed the officers who were marching them up this incline. As they were just about there, they fell over dead. And it almost appears like these guys had to jump in themselves because there was nobody there to push them in. But anyway, they got in there somehow. But it was so hot, it killed the officers bringing them up there. Now, that should have been lesson enough for the king to see the folly of his plan. But then to see him jump in should have put the icing on the cake. But anyway, the king was positioned in such a way that he could look in there somehow. I don't know if he was above or if there was a hole in the side, he could look in. I don't know, but he saw what was going on in there. He wanted to watch them roast as crispy critters, I guess. He doesn't seem to have any remorse for his hotshot officers that died because he's so mad. He just wanted to see these guys burn. But he must have had an ulcer attack when he looked into the furnace, and instead of seeing 3 guys incinerating, he sees them walking around with ropes having been burned off of them, but seemingly unscathed. And beyond that, there was a 4th person who just showed up, and it appeared like the Son of God. That must have been something for him, who had put himself up as God, to see someone that looked like the Son of God in there with what he had just commanded for it to happen against these fellows that believed in this Son of God. When we are people of deep conviction with full confidence in his providence, who are truly committed to our God and his ways, he will often lead us to places and experiences which appear scary and dangerous, maybe even painful or deadly. But when we follow in faith, we learn that Jesus is there with us, even in those frightening places. Our Lord meets us in the furnaces of life. And as God says in Isaiah 43, "Do not fear, for I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." Do you believe that? Can you face your furnace knowing that God will be there with you? Nebuchadnezzar commanded the men to come out of the furnace. They probably would have liked to stayed longer because they were having a good time in there with, we don't know if this is a Christophany, if this is Christ himself, or if it's an angel, but whatever, it would have been great to have that time with the supernatural, wouldn't it? But he commanded them to come out, and in verse 27 says, these men on whose bodies the fire had no power, the hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. You remember what this place smelled like a year ago when the smoke and everything permeated it? I mean, I came in here that night, and it was just a real feeling of dread, of blackness, of ugliness. And I thought we'd never get rid of that smell, that oily, gunky smell. That's the way it is with smoke. If you're in the presence of smoke, you can't get rid of it. It sticks on you. But these guys were in the middle of it, and there wasn't even a trace of smoke in their garments. So Nebuchadnezzar again declares the superiority of Jehovah God, but we're going to see in chapter 4 he still didn't quite get it, and God wasn't done with him yet because he had another lesson for him to learn. You know, I don't know what your furnace might be. It might be at work with some mean people, and it's tough to even go to work every day because of the dreaded heat of the office. We had the family over last night for our 4th of July cookout. With even two of them, it's almost impossible to get them together anymore because of schedules. But anyway, we got to talking about Aaron, and remember a number of years ago he got Bell's palsy on his face, really a bad case of that. And he said he's pretty sure that came from stress of not wanting to come back from vacation to go to work, because it was just a terrible situation he was in right that time at a gospel bookstore in Lansing. And he was so stressed that it caused his physical problems. Maybe that's your furnace, that you just can't quite get yourself there, but you know you have to. Nebuchadnezzar was not exactly up to Employer of the Year award either with these 3 employees, but God used them and their conviction, their confidence, their commitment to work a change in that king's heart. It's not quite there yet, like I said. God's not quite done with him, but God will get him yet before this is done. But maybe God is asking you to face your furnace, not only to try your faith, but to minister to someone else. I can't imagine the effect that this experience must have had on those hundreds of people who saw, first of all, the commitment to stand up for what they believed, to go through the punishment, and then to come out completely unscathed. That must have been something that would affect your heart, wouldn't it? How could you see that and not be affected? So maybe you're asked to go through what you're going through so that others will come to know God because of that. He'll meet you in there. He's able to deliver you. It's a great place to experience true fellowship, as they found out, with the one who saves you. And nothing is more wonderful than coming out of that experience, knowing you've advanced in your kingdom dwelling, conquering the swamp, because this swamp is not our home. And I hope we're finding that true. Let's pray.